Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ken Schwenke, and I am ProPublica's Senior Editor for Data and News Apps. For those that are new to us, ProPublica is a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to investigative journalism. Earlier this month, we introduced the Private School Demographics Database, which makes it easy to look up schools and match them to their surrounding public school districts, enabling parents, researchers, and journalists to directly compare the makeup of private schools to the local public school systems. What it shows is that private schools in the United States are, on the whole, whiter than public schools with fewer Black and Hispanic or Latino students. That statistic may not surprise you because private schools have a reputation for being expensive and exclusionary, but it had not been previously easy to pin that down in a data way. While there is no comprehensive national list of private schools, we use the relatively obscure National Center for Education Statistics Private School Survey. It has gathered information about US private schools every other year since 1989, and that helped us start our analysis. We'll dig into our methodology in a little bit, but first we wanted to share some background as to why we created this database and why we made it publicly available, and then how to use it and how you can find your own stories in it. In today's webinar, we'll show you how to make the most of this database, including its advanced search features. We will largely focus on how journalists can use this tool to conduct their own reporting, but this information will be available to anyone who is interested in the current debate over school choice, vouchers, and the privatization of education. We received tons of questions in advance, and we only have an hour to get through a lot of information, but we will do our best to address questions that have come in. You can submit a question at any time by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Towards the end of the program, we will share a link to the event survey. Your feedback will help inform the content of our future webinars, and we would really appreciate that. Now, allow me to introduce today's speakers. Joining us today are Nat Lash, Sergio Hernandez, and Jennifer Berry Hawes. Nat and Sergio are news app developers at ProPublica, and Jennifer is a reporter at ProPublica's newsroom in the South. Jennifer, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your reporting and the project that inspired this app?
Sure. Thanks, Ken. Yeah, happy to. I thought it might be helpful actually to go back and talk about how this got started. And it began really, I live in South Carolina, and here in my home state, there are many private schools that opened during the desegregation years and that remain very vastly white, and where the public schools remain very vastly Black. And so I wondered if this phenomenon was something that was across the South. And so last year was the 70th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And so we decided to take a deeper look at the phenomenon of schools called segregation academies. And these are private schools that opened during the desegregation years to white children whose families were leaving the public schools as Black children arrived at previously segregated schools. And so to inform that reporting, my colleague and I, my colleague Molly Simon, we decided that we should put together a master list of schools that likely opened as segregation academies. And to do this, we needed a couple of key things. One was we needed the founding year of the schools, and we needed to see what we could find out about the demographics of the enrollments of the schools. So we began looking around at things like old yearbooks and newspaper archives and things that are helpful but not really scientific in any way. And then we began looking at the National Center for Education Statistics website, which has on it school enrollment demographics, which for anyone who's reported on private schools, you know there's very little public information about them. So this website was hugely helpful because we could see what at least semi-recently school enrollments look like. And along the way, as we were doing some reporting, we realized that the private school survey you mentioned, which is what this database uses, actually went back 30 years, which was hugely helpful, except for the fact that the data is not kept in a way that the average person can really access. So that's when Ken and Nat and Sergio jumped in and started looking at the older data. And that was enormously helpful because then we could see what various private schools enrollment looked like, at least going back to the early 90s, which was as close to the opening of these private schools as we had ever found. So we began putting together this master list of segregation academies. And then really a key question emerged, which was, Are segregation academies still creating segregated school systems, which, as I mentioned, I had seen anecdotally across South Carolina. But we wanted to know if this was the case, which schools were creating the most segregated school systems and where were they? That was obviously critical to any kind of reporting. So that kind of launched a whole separate question of, well, can we see these private schools in the context of the communities where they operate, and also compare them to the local public school district? Because we didn't want to focus on segregation academies that were founded as such, but had come to better represent their communities, because that's really not what we were looking at. We were interested in schools that were still fomenting that kind of segregation. And so Nat and Sergio got on to this task of really putting these different sets of data together so that we could see the demographics of the private school, the demographics of the local public school district where it operates, and the community more broadly. And along the way, Nat ran a map for me that looked at communities where 75% or more of white children were attending private schools. And when he ran that, really two very clear clusters emerged. And one was in the Northeast around New York and New Jersey, where many white children attend Jewish day schools. And so you have a large private school system there that is white, and then you have public schools that are majority Black and Hispanic. And then the other cluster was perhaps not surprisingly across the Southeast. And these were mostly segregation academies. And it was really interesting that the data showed that there was a really large cluster of these schools, of these private schools that were very vastly white in Mississippi. And when I looked at that map, one school system really stood out, and that was in a place called Emmett County, which is a rural county in southern Mississippi on the Louisiana border. And there, the private schools were 96% or more white in a community that's really closer to 50-50, especially when you're looking just at school-age children. So pretty clearly, these private schools were all segregation academies that had landed on our list. And so we were able to see that, yes, the private schools there were siphoning off really almost all of the white children in town, and the public schools were 80 something percent Black. So I went to Emmett County and really wanted to understand this phenomenon and how this plays out in a community, because I know for me, I have two children, and a lot of the people that I have befriended over the years are people who, I met at the bus stop or, at baseball practice or PTA meetings, and all of the ways in which we meet people through our children's school. So I went to Emmett County, and it was really kind of driven home for me how segregated schools create segregated communities when I went to a high school football game. And we detail this in the story. I hope take a look at it. But in Emmett County, the main segregation academy in town almost abuts the public high school. So on Friday night football, both of the stands are lit up by football lights, and there's really just a tree line that separates them. So I went over to the public school systems high school football game, and and when I was there, it was very clear that almost all of the families in the stands were Black, almost all of the players were Black, cheerleaders were Black. So I was talking with a man who had graduated from that high school. He had coached its football team. And we decided to go over to the private school's football game. And we walked over, and there it was the exact opposite. Almost all of the families in the stands were white, all of the football players were white, all of the cheerleaders were white. And the man that I was with, he said, I've never stepped foot on this campus. So he was from that community. He had coached just, across the tree line, but he'd never been to that school. He didn't recognize most of the white people in the stands, even though they shared a community, a small community. He knew only a few people there because they worked at the public school system, because it paid better and the benefits were better, but they still sent their children to the private school. So it was this really stark sort of example of how school segregation really separates communities. And across the South, where there are segregation academies, it's been that way since, as long as anyone can remember, Black and white children really didn't go to school together much at all. And so therefore the communities were very separate. Um, and so I would never have gone to Emmett County if not for this data that showed us, A, how many white children were attending the private schools, but also how starkly different the public schools then looked. And so um, as we were working on this reporting, we began to all really realize that this could be a very useful tool for people far beyond our newsroom because private school information is so difficult to come by. And particularly now, as states are moving toward more expanded and universal voucher programs and voucher-like programs, hundreds of millions of public dollars are going into programs to fund education in private schools. We looked at segregation academies in this series, but this obviously can be very useful to people all across the country who are trying to learn more about the private school systems that money's funding, and also just to learn about how segregation's playing out in their communities. But it was extremely useful in our reporting, and I hope it's as useful for all of you. And I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'll pass it back to Ken. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a great series, a great story too. So would encourage folks to read it. And yeah, as Jennifer said, she had uncovered this data, or they had uncovered this data during the reporting of the story. We use it to help target news stories for the reporting, and then thought, why not make this a database that anybody can use? So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sergio Hernandez, who is going to do a walkthrough of some of the database's key features. Welcome, Sergio. You are muted, Sergio.
Oh, I was just thanking you. I was just saying thank you, Ken. I'm going to do a quick little walkthrough of the database and sort of an overview of the different data views that we have on here and some key features and our search. Let's see if I can just share my screen here. So the homepage for the app is pretty straightforward. Throughout the app, you'll see these little bar charts here that kind of do a quick at-a-glance breakdown of the demographics, usually comparing private schools, in this case, across the US to public schools across the US. And as we drill down, you'll see different versions of these charts doing this kind of comparison sort of at the state level, the school district level, and the sort of individual school to the district level. Going through here, we surface a couple of really interesting, sort of overwhelmingly white private schools broken up by region. And then this table that is a quick entry point into sort of each state, just to really help users quickly sort of drill down to where they want to go. Again, we've got these racial demographic bar charts and some just quick overview numbers of total private school enrollment, number of schools in the state, et cetera. At the top of the page, we have this search feature. You'll see this throughout the app as well, and I'll circle back to that in a moment. But we'll start here with just looking at a state page. I'm going to go for one that has a lot of private schools because it's useful for these kinds of demos. Again, here, the very familiar bar chart breaking down the demographics of the private schools in New York to public schools. We then break down private schools by two different sort of facets. One is sort of the religious orientation, and the other one is school type. These are some expandable tables, and you can click through these to get sort of a filtered list of all of the schools that fall into that bucket, in this case in New York. We then have, as you get deeper into the state page, a table of private schools in the state. And this is a searchable table, so you can hover over some of these column headers to do various searches, filters. You can clear the filters and various sorts. For instance, if you want to see the schools with the highest enrollment, the schools with the most teachers, that kind of thing. And then one of the things that, as Jennifer mentioned, that we really wanted to do with this data is sort of enable the ability to do some comparisons between private schools and the local public school community. So we did a bunch of matching to sort of group private schools into the local public school districts. So on the state page, you'll also find a table of all of the public school districts in that state, some key statistics about private schools in those districts' boundaries, and just an easy sort of entryway into a particular school district. You can also search here. So again, I'm just going to look for, I don't know, my space bar is stuck, but big one just to have some results to look at. So drilling down into the school district page here, you're going to get sort of a more detailed view of private schools, in this case, in the New York City public school system's boundaries. So that are private schools that are geographically located in the boundaries of that school's district. Our very familiar bar chart. On the district page, you'll see some familiar elements that are common to the state page, but in this case, we also have a map that shows the school district's boundaries and plots all of the private schools within it. We have here a feature where you can search for a school by name to filter this list down. The markers are color-coded by sort of the predominant racial category of the students in that school district. If it is your own school district where you are, when you're using the app, you can use this geolocation feature that will sort of zoom you into your neighborhood so you can see schools that are right next to you. Going further into this page here, we have another thing that is sort of new to this app is, again, as Jennifer mentioned, it used to be very difficult to be able to sort of get all of the historical data for these schools. There are a lot of text files on the education department's website that you can download and dig through. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is make that more accessible to get the sort of historical view. So here we've aggregated the private school data for all of the schools in the district, and you can do these comparisons to look by different racial category, how that trend has changed over time to see if the private schools have become, more white, more Black, less Hispanic. Choose what you want to look at, and sort of also see that in comparison to the local demographic trend in the public school district to see if that's sort of synced up with that. Again, we have this breakdown of schools by religion, schools by school type, and then another searchable table of all of the schools within this district's boundaries, which is very similar to the table on the state page. That is pretty much it for the district page. So we'll zoom in on an individual school. This is the one that's near me. Again, the bar chart here now comparing the private school to the local school district. Another version of that line chart where you can choose a racial category and compare how has the private school enrollment of that racial category changed in comparison to the local public school systems. We have here all of the sort of historical demographic data for the school that's compiled in one place. And one of the things that you're able to do here is we have this download feature, so you can actually download all of the historical responses for an individual school. We have the option to do that either as an Excel, a CSV, or as a JSON, whichever format you like to work with. And then, some more waypoints to other interesting stuff. So we have other nearby private schools that are close to the one that you're looking at. As I think we've mentioned, or we will mention, a lot of this data is self-reported by the private schools. So there are, various issues within it. And so if you see something that looks kind of off or unusual, we also include this feature to be able to sort of report anything that seems kind of not quite right. Those are the sort of, I guess, 3 or 4 main views of the data that we have in the app. And then the other thing that we can do is our search feature. So we have a pretty robust search interface here. You can search by keyword to look for schools by their name. You can also filter results by state, by religion, school type, enrollment range. For some of the schools, and this is because they actually stopped collecting this information in the mid-90s, but they did used to collect what year the school was founded. And this was very useful for our segregation academies reporting. So we do have the option to be able to look for schools based on when they were founded. By default, we only surface schools that have responded to the private school survey in the last few cycles. If you wanted to look at sort of the whole historical cache of data, you can untoggle this feature here and it will give you sort of an unfiltered view. And then for sort of the super users, the NCES assigns a unique identifier to schools that respond to the survey called an NCES ID. If you have a particular list of schools that you're interested in getting results for, you can put in a list of IDs here and filter that way, and then you'll just get the search results for that specific group of schools. The search results themselves will show, some basic directory information about the school. Again, school type, religious orientation, its predominant racial group in its student body, total enrollment, how recent the data is, and that kind of thing. And then we have various sort options here where you can sort by some of these metrics, including like how recently they responded, their name, change the sort order. This is the same search that's on the home page, but you'll also find it at the top of every individual page. In our little nav bar here. And we can also do, just again, you can usually get to a district page by looking for the search page, but for convenience, if you have a particular district that you want to look up, you can search for districts by name as well and get to them that way. I think that's pretty much it for me.
Thanks, Sergio. I wanted to address a question that came into the chat, which is just, is it possible to look up schools by county? And I think the answer to that is no, but you can look them up by district, which are, relatively similar in some cases.
It usually depends. In some parts of the country, counties and school districts tend to be coterminous. So like in the South, this works really well. In other places, like in California, where I'm from, and that's a great example. I'm from Los Angeles, so there's not really a county school system. There's a lot of school districts in LA County, and then even within my hometown, there's like 2 school districts because one is for the elementary school, and then one is for the high schoolers. So the best way to kind of look for it is through the state and the school district.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Sergio. And now I would like to introduce Nat Lash, who is going to show some more examples and talk about how to use this tool as well as potential reporting threads. But first, he's going to share some important notes about the data and our methodology.
That's right. So just a couple notes about kind of our source for the data. This comes from the private school survey, which comes from the National Center for Education Statistics, the NCES. And just a few notes. It's not an absolute coverage of every private school every time they do these additions. In recent years, there's been a response rate of about 75% to 77% in 2021. But one thing that we try to do is that it's very likely that a private school will have responded at some point. So rather than exclusively look at one particular year or something, we're trying to make it so that if a private school responded at some point, we'll be able to find that data and surface it up. Yeah, so what we're all here for, figuring out how to use this to get some scoops, get some stories. The last note that I'll share on kind of the data source is, again, because this is a federal data set that is done via a survey. They mail out surveys, email out surveys, wait for responses, bring them all together, do a lot of statistical work on them. It is a slowly updating data set. So it's every 2 years. So the most recent data that we have published on this app is from the 2021-2022 school year. And the next edition is going to be 2023 and 2024, which I do not expect to be published until next fall, or I guess now it's 2025 in the fall or December. So we're hoping to get that data up when it's published, but until then, we're kind of working with some pretty old data. Nonetheless, we think it's pretty useful. And let me screen share and get going. All right, one cool trick, if you want to just go straight into search, is just hit enter on that little thing, and it'll bring you right into the search results. So I think as like a data journalist, like one of the first things that you do is you pop open a spreadsheet, sort by some number, because we're all about outliers when we start off on a story. So one thing that I wanted to show y'all how we did was basically use this search to get going on kind of the reporting that Jennifer was doing. So what we got is, I'm going to bring it into the states of Alabama and Mississippi, which is where a lot of the segregation academies that we're covering looking at, and then we're going to sort by a thing called racial difference, which is a little metric that we did exclusively so that you can have something to sort by. I'll tell you in a sec about that. And we also broke it up so that you can kind of filter out some of the smaller schools. As you can see, there's a lot of very small private schools included in this survey. And I think just for this demo, it's good to just kind of uncheck that box. So you got your filters, we're doing states, and we're gonna hit search. We're gonna come up with the list. So right away, this is our list of schools that we're already like kind of interested in. We got Wilcox Academy, which I believe was the subject of one of the stories, and it pops up to the very top of that list using racial difference. And what that is basically we're just comparing the largest racial group in the school to that racial group in the school district. So for something like Wilcox Academy, which is within the Wilcox County School District, what we're doing is we're looking at the percent white in the private school and subtracting it from the percent white in that school district, and we're getting 97 percentage points. And so this is a good way of kind of basically servicing schools that are kind of like out of line with them. And a fun thing is also we immediately are coming up with the year that this school was founded. This is a fun feature that Sergio worked really hard on building out because it hasn't been in recent editions, but we were able to kind of get that up in there. You'll see a lot of schools that are high on this list, established in 1970, established in 1969, 1965, 1965, 1965, 1966. And so this is basically coming up with a pretty reliable list of the segregation academies that Jennifer has been looking at this whole time. So then we got other ways to look at this. We got districts. Our district search is not as robust as our school search, unfortunately, because essentially like the first thing that this does is surfacing the data that we have on private schools, but we still wanted to have a way for people to kind of surface these. One thing I thought was interesting was kind of, as Jennifer said, we're looking at New York and New Jersey, all these school districts, and we're going to use the same metric. So I'm filtering down to New York and New Jersey and school districts, and I'm sorting again by that racial difference, which works very similarly to how it works there. And we start off seeing like some weird looking data. We got some private schools in Rhinebeck that just has a few students. Lyme Central has one private school student that we're including. And this is just to note kind of like, take a look at the denominator, take a look at how many students you're actually looking at if you're trying to make some sort of statement about what you're seeing. But when we get down to it, we start to see some of these school districts that really have popped up in our reporting. East Ramapo and Lakewood Township are two school districts that are really marked by a private school system, usually in the form of Jewish day schools, in generally alongside a public school system that is largely non-white. So we see this in a few pockets around that corridor. East Ramapo, Lakewood is a really interesting example of this too. Anyone has been looking at that, and you can just see we have some just very large Jewish day schools that we can just kind of start clicking around, start learning a little bit about. We also have a feature that I kind of like for school districts in the same way. And this is one thing you can look out for. So as I kind of said, the data that we get out of this is incomplete because it's a survey and people are responding to surveys. NCES uses this and actually like weights things out to try to get estimates of how many private school students live in an area, but it's not really designed for something as small as a school district. So we are using the count of students that we're seeing in the most recent year that we have data for. But you get really interesting things nonetheless when you kind of compare the public school student body to the private school city body, private school student body. So you get Curious Joel, which has very few public school students, but 8,000 private school students. Lakewood's another good example of that, where there's 5,500 public school students that are mostly Hispanic and over 30,000 private school students in the same area. Search is very useful for kind of finding these, but if you're working within a state, one thing that is very useful is, again, head over to that state page, because what you're doing with search is you're looking into our database. What we have on the state pages is we're loading a lot of the data just right onto the page for you. So in the same way that you can kind of search and sort, we have a few more features actually on the state pages that you can sort, you can filter out and go down to the particular religious groups that you want to look at, or select all and uncheck them. And this is just a nice way to kind of start to find schools that you're looking for in neighborhoods that you're looking for. It also comes up with a list of all the school districts that we're including in the database. Yeah, I think the state pages are super useful for finding whatever you're looking for. What else? We also got a question. So one place that someone asked about in particular was the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Let me pop that open. All right, we got Dallas Independent School District, and this is actually one of a very interesting school district. I know there's a bunch in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. This is a nice way to kind of start to look at the schools in the area. We can pop out actually immediately and just look at the particular types of schools that we're looking at. We want to see Baptist schools that are mostly white. We have a way of doing that. Christian. Yeah, it's just a nice way to kind of start to look at the private schools in your area. Yeah. I don't know, Ken, is there anything else in Reporter Recipe you want me to show you?
No, I think you think you went over most pertinent things. I think it's worth just as you said, pointing out that if you go to a state or a district page, you get a list of the schools and the districts. And so if you are a reporter and you're interested in like comparing schools within your district, obviously you could look at the different pages for those schools, but you could also look on the district page or the state page, and we'll be able to see those differences reflected in the tables there. So maybe a little easier for you to sort of like scan and figure it out. But as Nat noted, lots of sorting, to kind of see like what is the, most this that can help you sort of zero in on what you're interested in finding. So thank you, Nat. Now we're going to turn to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Thank you again for any questions that you've submitted ahead of time. We got a lot of them. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit it to us. Our first question that was pre-submitted, Nat, this is for you. This reporter asks, how did you verify the data? The list might include schools that have closed, or there could be new schools that have recently opened and not yet included. So how did you confirm whether a school existed or anything like that?
We did a few things to do what we can within the realm of this actual survey. So again, it's kind of a point in time. Our most recent data is from 21-22, and we're trying to show if there's data from 21-22 to note it, and otherwise we're not trying to say what's happening at the school like today. That's y'all's job as reporters. So there is a couple interesting things that we did do. We got via a FOIA, and then eventually they decided to just start publishing it because I think they agreed that it was a useful tool for researchers to use as well. Details on basically they call it a frame list, which is essentially they are going out there and they're trying to get a list of every school, sending out surveys and getting those surveys back. And when they do that, they're making notes of, hey, is this school still open actually? And so when a school comes off of that frame list, as it's called, we're trying to make a note of it in the database if that shows up in the data. And or sometimes there's errors in the data, and sometimes they are like, oh, this is a duplicate school entry. We're making a note of that in the frame list survey too. So that's something pretty useful that we did to try to address some of that. But yeah, new schools could have opened since 21-22. There also could have been schools that haven't been responding to the survey. There are sometimes state education board, state agency lists that you can try to look at to figure out, is that the zone that you're looking at? So yeah.
So we got extra data from NCES that does tell us some of that information. And we did try to, like, smooth out some errors in the data, but we know that there are some problems and we know that there are schools missing. Relatedly, Nat, not to keep you on the horn, but the other question we got related to that is, how do you know the data is nationally representative of private schools, since filling out the NCS survey is voluntary? What percent of private schools filled out the survey in 2021, 2022, and did you account for potential self-selection bias?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier, 77% of the schools on that list that the NCES produced responded to the survey. In earlier editions of the survey, it was something like 90%. And it's hard to know whether that's because they were more responsive or their list was less complete. So yeah, I guess that's just keep in mind the whole thing is built to be a survey. We are using the data that they use to conduct that survey, which creates estimates. But we're using that raw data to actually like let people see what the responses are, and deal with them and use it. So
cool. And there are a couple other things I've just seen. A couple of people have asked about tuition data. Is tuition data in NCES?
Sergio, the answer I'm 99% certain is no.
The answer is no. They do not collect tuition data. The PSS is actually like very thin on what it actually collects. It is mainly enrollment numbers, racial demographics, some stuff on like teachers and staffing ratios, and then like a lot of directory information. And I like there are like 3 different versions of like religion, depending on how much you want to drill down into a denomination. Things like like specific religious associations that the school might be affiliated with and that kind of thing. But in terms of like economic stuff like tuition, that's not collected.
Yeah, someone also asked if there was accreditation information. So that's a no, but some of these organization affiliations, we didn't actually do the work to kind of standardize those lists. But in the raw data, those affiliations are available, right? Or yeah.
Cool. There is another question that I'm not sure. I think the answer to is yes, but not in our tool. Is there any way of overlaying data on communities where school vouchers exist? I am interested in exploring whether or not vouchers increase choice or merely advance the benefit of the privilege.
Yeah, I think you've stumbled into a lot of the other reporting that has been done at ProPublica on education this year. So one thing I would say is there hasn't been, again, this is going from 21-22 is the most recent stuff, and I think a lot of our universal voucher programs that people are talking about are even more recent than that. Our one team in Arizona did some work on the expansion of vouchers in Arizona, but you can still kind of use this data to do something useful. I pulled up Eli and Lucas's awesome story. Sorry, I have flies everywhere and I could just keep grabbing them. Sorry. um, but what we got is, Eli and Lucas were talking to families that are looking to, make use of this universal voucher program. And I think a lot of the story was, for a lot of reasons, it's still out of reach for a lot of families, even if there's a voucher that covers for parents who are already in private schools can start to use. And so one thing that you can do is, again, there's a good chance of the schools that are covered in the voucher, if they're not brand new, have responded to the survey in the past. You can start to pull up some of the schools that Eli and Lucas were writing about, like 91st Psalm is right here. You can kind of see what these families in this neighborhood and that school district are. So there's still, we want to eventually be able to work in vouchers and that kind of thing, but right now these programs are all over the place. And so it's not a feature yet, but it's kind of front of mind. It's like basically one of the main reasons why we produced this app in the first place, even though we don't have that within the data set. We think it's a useful tool if you are writing about vouchers to start to use. So
yeah, I have to see another question here about enrollment, which says, can you determine enrollment from one year to the next to see growth, perhaps as a result of vouchers? The answer, which I believe is we have, we have all the data on these that they've filled out. Each school has filled out in the survey over the years. And so that includes enrollment data. So you should be able to see that.
Yeah, suffice to say, we're very interested in seeing the 2023-2024 results.
Yes, exactly. A couple other questions. I see one, is there an API for the app? There is not. A couple things about data access. You can download historical data for each individual school. So you can download, I think, as Sergio showed, a spreadsheet for each individual school. You could say, go ahead and do that for a bunch of schools in a district and combine them. We don't currently have a data for like a state or a district download, let's say, all of the school data for the most recent year in a district, although it's an interesting idea, and we will talk about that. But that is sort of how you can access the data currently as it stands. A couple of other questions. There was one question that was submitted for the webinar. I don't know if anybody has an answer to this, but having worked at an independent boarding school in Mexico for 30 years, did you find more diversity in the northern independent schools rather than the local public school?
I am glad someone brought that up. Let me, one more screen share. So there aren't like kind of national findings that we're looking at, but I think it raises the question of, we're sorting by that. Let me see if I can just pull up like Massachusetts right here. Racial difference, but let's do ascending instead of descending. Let me filter out kind of the little schools. Because there's also a way to kind of surface the schools that are notably more diverse than say somewhere in Massachusetts. So I think that's also like worth noting that like just as we sort from the highest level of like kind of this disparity, you can also look at it to find more diverse schools than the areas that they're in, like this school. I think these are a few actually kind of good examples of that just within Massachusetts. So yeah, that's just another thing to keep in mind. Stop share. Here we go.
Good question, and a good note on a different way of looking at the data. Let's see. To Mary, one that just came in, does ProPublica plan to do a searchable video on voting patterns compared to registered voters? Not currently. We have certainly worked with voting data before, but it's an interesting idea, and I'm sure we'll consider it. We're happy to answer any other Q&A questions that you may have. So feel free to type any. Oh, and one other question about, can you see a specific public school data in this app? No, we use the public school data to aggregate to the district level as a comparison for the private school information. ProPublica does have an older public school demographic app, but not specifically demographic, sort of achievement and opportunity called Opportunity Gap. But we have not updated it in a little bit, and we probably should. But there is data about that. And then I'm going to wrap this up on the last question. Actually, the very last question is, will it be available later online? And the answer is yes. But one more question that I'm going to toss to Jennifer, Sergio, and Nat. I know we've talked a little bit about this throughout the thing, but what are a few examples of basic story ideas that could be spun off from this data? Do you have thoughts, sort of parting thoughts for the journalists here on sort of basic ways of taking a look at this? Do not all jump in at once, journalists of ours.
One thing I would just encourage people to do is to look at their individual areas, because we were talking about a lot of different story ideas, like the communities in the Northeast that Nat touched on, that we didn't report out, that I think lend a lot of, just have a lot of reporting opportunities. I know in the communities that I went to, and someone asked in the chat about things like school bond referendums and stuff like that, where communities where most of the white children went to private schools, were those communities willing to support, property tax increases or other types of referendum? It was really a mixed bag. So I feel like, from our perspective, looking at it nationally, but I think for local reporters, it would be really interested to dig into. For instance, I did write a story about Wilcox County, which Nat mentioned. And in in Alabama, the state has to approve putting to the voters the question of whether to raise property taxes above a certain amount. And in Wilcox County, it was interesting that some of the larger white timber landowners had gone to the legislature and gotten them to basically not allow them to bring to a vote the question of whether to raise property taxes on a school district that's majority Black in the public schools. And that's a really interesting local story that I think would be worth taking a look at. So I'm excited to see what y'all come up with in your states and in your communities.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, I believe that is about our time for today. I want to thank all of our panelists, Jennifer, Sergio, and Nat, for this detailed walkthrough. Please, if you want to stay up to date on all of our upcoming programs, you can visit our event page, which is propublica.org/events. And from all of us at ProPublica, thank you for joining us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.